April 13th, 1940, 13:47 hours, fjord, northern Norway. The Junkers Ju-87 Stuka screamed down through broken cloud, its dive brakes shrieking as the pilot lined up his approach on the grey warship steaming below. From 3,000 feet, HMS Warspite looked exactly like what she was. An old battleship from another war, her lines dating to 1913, her massive 15-inch guns trained toward the German destroyers sheltering in Narvik harbor. The bomb fell clean, a 500-pound explosive that struck Warspite's starboard side near the funnel. The detonation tore through 2 decks, igniting ammunition stores and flooding compartments. Fire erupted from the wound, black smoke pouring into the Arctic sky. The Stuka pilot, climbing away, radioed his controller with confidence. Direct hit, heavy cruiser, possibly battleship. Target burning, listing. Assess, destroyed. Below decks, leading stoker Albert Marsh picked himself up from where the blast had thrown him, his ears ringing, blood streaming from a cut above his eye. Around him, the boiler room was chaos, steam hissing from ruptured pipes, water rushing in from breached hull plates, flames visible through the doorway aft. The ship shuddered, listing perceptibly to starboard. Every instinct screamed at him to get topside, to abandon this flooding steel coffin before she rolled and took them all down. Instead, he grabbed a damage control plank and shouted to the nearest sailor, "Get that valve shut, we're not letting her go." The crew of HMS Warspite, that April morning off the Norwegian coast, made a decision that would define the ship's legend. They refused to let her die. The old warrior, by 1940, Warspite was already an anachronism, a relic of naval warfare's previous age, still somehow fighting in its current one. Launched in 1913 at Devonport Dockyard, she had been built for the battleship duels of the Jutland era. Massive guns, heavy armor, designed to stand in the line of battle and trade salvos with enemy dreadnoughts at ranges of 10 or 15,000 yards. She'd done exactly that at the Battle of Jutland in 1916, where her guns had pounded German battlecruisers while she herself absorbed 15 hits, her steering jammed, her decks strewn with casualties, yet somehow remaining afloat and fighting. The Great War had ended. Treaties limited naval construction. Warspite should have been scrapped, but the Royal Navy, perpetually short of capital ships and funds, instead gave her a comprehensive rebuild in the 1930s. New engines, updated armor, modern fire control systems, additional anti-aircraft guns. When she emerged from the yards in 1937, she was faster and more capable than her original design, yet still fundamentally a ship from another era. Her silhouette unmistakable, her reputation established, her crew proud to serve aboard what sailors called the Grand Old Lady. When war came again in September 1939, Warspite was assigned to the home fleet at Scapa Flow. At 26 years old, she was ancient by warship standards. Modern battleships like King George V and Prince of Wales were under construction, but they wouldn't be ready for years. Until then, Britain would fight with what it had, and what it had included ships like Warspite, old, battered, but still capable of bringing overwhelming firepower to bear when needed. In April 1940, Germany invaded Norway. British forces, attempting to intervene, found themselves facing not just the Wehrmacht ashore, but the Kriegsmarine's destroyers in the narrow Norwegian fjords. The First Battle of Narvik on April 10th had been inconclusive. British destroyers had sunk several German ships but taken losses themselves. The situation required something heavier, something that could steam into confined waters and simply overwhelm the enemy through sheer gunpower. The Admiralty sent Warspite into the fjord. The morning of April 13th found Warspite approaching fjord with 9 destroyers in company. Captain Douglas Fisher Hatt stood on his bridge, studying the snow-covered mountains rising steeply on either side of the fjord entrance. The tactical situation was straightforward and deeply unfavorable. He would be taking a battleship, slow, large, difficult to maneuver, into confined waters where German destroyers could use the terrain for cover, where aircraft could attack from above without warning, where a single lucky torpedo could cripple his ship with nowhere to run. Fisher Hatt ordered the advance anyway. This was what battleships were for, going where smaller ships couldn't, accepting risks because the mission required it, trusting in armor and guns and crew to see them through. The German destroyers in Narvik harbor had been trapped there since the first battle 3 days earlier, low on fuel and ammunition, unable to break out past British forces, but still dangerous and desperate. As Warspite steamed deeper into the fjord, her spotting aircraft, a Fairy Swordfish launched by catapult, radioed back positions and targets. The old battleship's main guns traversed, their directors calculating range and bearing with the precision of mathematics translated into high explosive. At 12:30 hours, Warspite opened fire. The sound of 15-inch guns in confined waters was apocalyptic, concussive blasts that echoed off mountains and shattered windows in Narvik town 3 miles distant. Each shell weighed nearly a ton and could penetrate 14 inches of armor at 10,000 yards. Against destroyers, with perhaps an inch of steel protecting their vital spaces, the effect was not combat, but annihilation. The first salvo struck the German destroyer Erich Kullner at anchor. One shell passed completely through the thin-hulled vessel and detonated in the water beyond. Another struck near the waterline and exploded inside, breaking the destroyer's back. She rolled and sank within 2 minutes, her crew having no time to abandon ship. Warspite's guns shifted to the next target, and the next, working methodically through the German force, while her escorting destroyers hunted down survivors trying to escape up the fjord. By early afternoon, 8 German destroyers had been sunk or run aground and abandoned. The Battle of Narvik was over, the most decisive single-ship action of the war. Warspite had steamed into a tactical nightmare and emerged victorious through the simple application of overwhelming firepower delivered with professional competence. German survivors would later describe the action with something approaching awe. A massive British battleship appearing in waters too confined for such vessels, firing with mechanical precision, destroying an entire flotilla in hours. Then the Luftwaffe arrived. The moment of truth. The Stuka attack came without warning. The dive bomber dropping through cloud cover too quickly for effective anti-aircraft response. The bomb that struck Warspite's starboard side was the kind of hit that should have been catastrophic, penetrating deep into the ship's interior, starting fires in spaces filled with ammunition and fuel, flooding compartments critical to stability and buoyancy. Below decks, damage control parties faced the immediate crisis: fire, flood, and the very real possibility of secondary explosions that could tear the ship apart from within. The hit had ruptured steam lines in the boiler rooms, filling spaces with superheated vapor that could cook a man alive. Water rushed in through hull breaches, threatening to overwhelm pumps and flood the engineering spaces that kept the ship mobile. Smoke choked passageways, making it nearly impossible to see or breathe. Standard procedure in such circumstances was clear: evacuate damaged sections, seal bulkheads, accept the loss of those compartments, and focus on saving the rest of the ship. But Warspite's crew, perhaps drawing on the ship's history or their own stubborn refusal to yield, chose a different path. They went into the damaged spaces. leading Stoker Marsh and his team, fought their way through steam-filled compartments with wooden shores and canvas patches, materials that seemed absurdly inadequate against the sea pressing in through torn steel. They worked in near-total darkness, the ship's lighting knocked out, navigating by touch and memory while water rose around their legs. When pumps failed, they formed human chains, passing buckets hand to hand. When bulkheads threatened to give way, they braced them with anything available: timbers, steel rods, their own bodies when necessary. Topside, the ship continued to fight. Captain Fisher Hatt, assessing the damage and the tactical situation, made the calculation every warship commander dreads. Could his ship survive to reach safe waters, or should he beach her on the Norwegian coast and accept her loss while saving his crew? The damage reports coming from below were grim: flooding in multiple compartments, fires still burning, structural damage that had weakened hull integrity. The ship was listing, down by the stern, her speed reduced. But the reports also indicated that damage control was holding. Barely. The flooding was being contained, if not stopped. The fires were being fought, if not extinguished. The ship was hurt, badly, but still operational. Fisher Hatt ordered continued withdrawal down the fjord toward open water. Warspite would not be abandoned while she could still steam. The withdrawal took hours, the old battleship limping along at reduced speed while her crew fought to keep her afloat. German aircraft made additional attacks, but none scored hits as damaging as the first. By nightfall, Warspite had reached open water and turned south toward Scapa Flow. Behind her in Narvik harbor, 8 German destroyers lay on the bottom, the price extracted before the Luftwaffe had exacted its own payment. The German pilot who'd struck Warspite submitted his combat report with confidence. 1 British battleship, heavily damaged, assessed, destroyed, or disabled. Luftwaffe intelligence accepted the report, marked HMS Warspite as effectively removed from service, and began planning operations that assumed 1 less British capital ship in Norwegian waters. 3 weeks later, after emergency repairs at Scapa Flow, Warspite returned to combat operations. The German assessment had been premature. Mediterranean thunder. By July 1940, the strategic situation had transformed. France had fallen. Italy had entered the war. Britain now faced hostile naval forces in the Mediterranean while simultaneously defending home waters against German threats. The Royal Navy, already stretched thin, found itself conducting simultaneous operations across multiple theaters with forces inadequate to all of them. Warspite deployed to the Mediterranean as part of Force H, based at Alexandria, tasked with contesting Italian naval dominance in the central Mediterranean. The Italian Regia Marina possessed modern, fast battleships and a numerical advantage in cruisers and destroyers. On paper, British forces were outmatched. In practice, British ships carried advantages that didn't appear in fleet registers: better fire control, more aggressive tactics, and crews willing to close to decisive range regardless of odds. On July 9, 1940, British and Italian fleets met off Calabria in what became known as the Battle of Punto Stilo. Warspite, flagship of the British force, engaged the Italian battleship Giulio Cesare at extreme range, 26,000 yards, among the longest-range gunnery hits ever recorded in naval combat. Warspite's 15-inch shell struck Giulio Cesare's aft funnel, penetrating deep into the ship and forcing the Italian fleet to withdraw behind smoke screens. The hit itself was significant but not crippling. Its psychological effect was profound. Italian Naval Command, observing that British battleships could score hits at ranges previously considered impossible, adopted increasingly cautious tactics. Italian capital ships, though modern and capable, began avoiding engagement unless they possessed overwhelming advantage. This conservatism effectively ceded control of the central Mediterranean to British forces that by any objective measure should have been overwhelmed by superior Italian numbers. Warspite continued operations throughout 1940 and 1941. Shore bombardments supporting British forces in North Africa, convoy protection against Italian air and naval attacks, presence operations that forced Italian fleet units to remain in port rather than risk engagement. The old battleship became a symbol of British persistence in a theatre where persistence often mattered more than perfection. In March 1941, the Italian fleet attempted a major operation to intercept British convoys south of Crete. British intelligence, reading Italian naval codes through ultra-intercepts, knew the Italian force was coming and positioned ships accordingly. Warspite, along with battleships Valiant and Barham, intercepted the Italian force off Cape Matapan on the evening of March 28th. The Battle of Cape Matapan became a night surface action, the kind of close-range melee that favored British training and fire control. Warspite and her consorts engaged Italian cruisers at ranges as close as 3,000 yards, searchlights illuminating targets for gunners who fired with mechanical precision. 3 Italian heavy cruisers were sunk in minutes, torn apart by shells they never saw coming. 2 destroyers went down with them. The Italian fleet withdrew in disorder, having lost 5 ships without inflicting significant damage in return. Warspite emerged from Matapan with her reputation enhanced, her crew's confidence unshaken, her systems proven in the kind of close action that tested every aspect of a warship's design and her people's training. But the Mediterranean was growing more dangerous. German forces were deploying to the theatre, bringing Luftwaffe expertise and dive bombers that had already proven their effectiveness against warships. In May 1941, during operations off Crete, German aircraft caught Warspite at sea. Repeated bombing attacks hit the battleship, causing casualties and damage that required repairs at American shipyards, the closest facilities capable of handling such extensive work. Warspite sailed to Bremerton, Washington, where American shipwrights marveled at the punishment the old ship had absorbed and continued to absorb. Repairs took months, but when complete, Warspite returned to service, this time deploying to the Indian Ocean for operations against Japanese forces. The longest day, June 6, 1944. The invasion of Normandy required naval gunfire support on a scale never before attempted. Hundreds of ships providing covering fire for troops assaulting fortified beaches, suppressing German positions, interdicting reinforcements. The Royal Navy assembled every available capital ship capable of shore bombardment. Among them, HMS Warspite, now 31 years old, assigned to bombard German positions at Sword Beach. Warspite took position offshore before dawn. Her 15-inch guns elevated toward pre-designated targets identified through intelligence and aerial reconnaissance. At 05:30 hours, she opened fire. The old battleship's guns, which had fired at Jutland 28 years earlier, now pounded German concrete fortifications, trenches, and artillery positions. Her gunners worked with practiced efficiency, loading and firing in cycles measured in minutes, each salvo delivering nearly 8 tons of high explosive onto targets several miles inland. The bombardment continued throughout the morning. German defenders, pinned in their positions by fire from ships they couldn't see, found themselves unable to effectively resist the Allied landings. British troops advancing off the beaches encountered German positions that had been pulverized by naval gunfire. Bunkers collapsed, artillery destroyed, trenches buried. Warspite's contribution to the success at Sword Beach was measured not in ships sunk or enemy vessels engaged, but in lives saved. British soldiers who crossed beaches and advanced inland because German defenders had been suppressed by fire from old guns still doing their work 3 decades after their construction. The Normandy bombardment pushed Warspite's ancient systems to their limits. Her guns, fired thousands of times over 3 decades of service, showed wear that no amount of maintenance could fully address. Barrels that had been relined multiple times exhibited internal stresses that affected accuracy. Fire control systems, upgraded repeatedly but fundamentally based on 1930s technology, required constant adjustment. The ship herself, stressed by decades of combat and heavy seas, developed leaks and mechanical failures that kept damage control parties perpetually employed. But she continued firing. D-Day, D+1, D+2, each day bringing new fire missions, new targets, new demands on ship and crew. Warspite's guns provided the kind of mobile, responsive fire support that proved invaluable as Allied forces expanded their beachhead and pushed inland. German counterattacks were broken up by naval gunfire, called in by forward observers. Fortified positions were reduced by shells that simply overwhelmed defensive structures. The old battleship did what battleships had always been designed to do: bring overwhelming firepower to bear at the decisive point. Then, on June 13th, disaster struck again. A German glider bomb, a radio-controlled weapon dropped from aircraft at high altitude, struck Warspite's starboard side, penetrating into the engine rooms. The explosion disabled one engine room completely, damaged another, and started fires that threatened magazines. The ship lost power, went dead in the water, began to list as flooding overwhelmed pumps. Once again, German reconnaissance reported the old battleship destroyed. Once again, the assessment proved premature. Warspite's crew, drawing on experience accumulated over years of combat damage, fought to save their ship for what must have seemed like the 100th time. They sealed bulkheads, contained flooding, fought fires, and eventually restored enough power to get the ship moving under partial propulsion. Destroyers came alongside to assist, taking the battleship under tow when her own engines proved insufficient. The journey back to Portsmouth took 2 days, Warspite crawling along at reduced speed, her crew keeping her afloat through skill and sheer bloody-minded refusal to surrender. In Portsmouth, damage assessment teams surveyed the ship and recommended she be paid off, retired from service, her useful life finally exhausted. Warspite was too damaged, too old, required too many repairs that couldn't be justified given the war's stage and available resources. Other ships, newer and less damaged, needed the dockyard capacity. The recommendation was accepted. After 31 years of service, 2 world wars, 6 major battles, and more combat actions than any other British warship, HMS Warspite was finally done. The final defiance. The end of hostilities in 1945 found Warspite moored in Portsmouth, a harbour relic awaiting disposal. The Royal Navy, faced with massive post-war reductions, was decommissioning hundreds of ships. Warspite, too damaged for further service and too expensive to repair, was sold for scrap in 1947. She would be towed to a breaker's yard, cut apart, her steel recycled, an ignoble end, perhaps, but the fate of all warships that survive their wars. On April 23, 1947, tugs took the old battleship in tow for her final journey to the breakers at Faslane. The route would take them around Cornwall, through waters Warspite knew well from decades of service. The weather was fair, the tow proceeding normally, when a storm developed with unexpected ferocity in Mounts Bay, off the Cornish coast. The storm, what sailors call a weather bomb, brought winds that overwhelmed the tug's ability to maintain control of their massive charge. Tow cables snapped. Warspite, dead in the water, but still massive and subject to wind and wave, began drifting toward shore. The tug struggled to reconnect, but the old battleship's momentum and the storm's force made it impossible. Shortly after midnight on April 24th, Warspite grounded on rocks near Prussia Cove, Cornwall. Salvage crews arrived once the storm passed, intending to refloat the ship and complete the tow to the breakers. But Warspite had grounded hard, her hull settling onto rocks in a position that made refloating difficult and dangerous. Initial attempts failed. The ship's own weight had driven her hull into the seabed, creating suction that resisted efforts to pull her free. Each tide settled her more firmly. Over the following months, salvage companies tried repeatedly to refloat Warspite. They pumped out flooded compartments, placed additional cables, waited for spring tides that might provide the lift needed to break her free. Nothing worked. The old battleship, having survived bombs and torpedoes and shell fire, had found her final position and refused to budge. Eventually, the salvage companies gave up on refloating her intact and instead began scrapping her in place, cutting the hull apart and removing sections piecemeal. The work took years. Cornish locals grew accustomed to seeing the old battleship's silhouette offshore, gradually disappearing as salvage crews cut away pieces. Some sections were simply too difficult to remove and were left in place, where they remain today. Twisted steel on Cornish rocks, the physical remnants of a ship that had refused to die quietly. Steel and stubbornness. The final accounting of HMS Warspite's service reads like a catalogue of improbable survival. She'd been hit by bombs, shells, torpedoes, and mines. She'd been declared destroyed by German forces at least 3 times. She'd survived damage that would have sunk lesser ships, continued operations when reasonable judgment suggested she should withdraw, and repeatedly returned to service when enemy intelligence assessed her as permanently disabled. Her battle honours included Jutland, Narvik, Calabria, Matapan, Crete, Sicily, Salerno, and Normandy. Campaigns spanning 2 world wars and 3 decades, actions against German, Italian, and Japanese forces across 3 oceans. She'd fired her guns in anger more times than any other British battleship. She'd earned more battle honours than any ship in Royal Navy history. 15 battle stars adorned her battle ensign, each representing a major action, each marking a moment when the old ship had gone forward into danger and emerged battered but intact. The crew who'd served aboard her numbered in the thousands over her 3 decades of service. Many had joined as young men and left as veterans, shaped by service aboard a ship that taught them what endurance meant. They'd learned their profession in her engine rooms and turrets and damage control stations, learned that ships don't survive through luck, but through the competence and determination of the people who operate them. When veterans gathered in later years for reunions, they spoke of Warspite with something beyond ordinary shipboard pride. They'd served aboard a ship that should have died multiple times but didn't. That kept going because her crew kept her going. That embodied a peculiarly British form of stubbornness that couldn't conceive of surrender while any alternative remained. A German naval officer, captured late in the war and interviewed about British warships, was asked about Warspite specifically. His response was simple. "We sank that ship 3 times. She was still there at the end. What else can you say?" What else indeed? Statistics don't capture what Warspite represented. Numbers can document her gun's caliber, her armor's thickness, her speed and displacement, and battle honors. They cannot measure the determination of crews who fought to save her when damage should have been fatal, or the stubbornness of a ship that somehow absorbed punishment and continued, or the symbolic power of an old battleship that simply refused to die no matter how many times enemies declared her destroyed. The British don't build monuments to their warships the way some nations do. Warspite exists now, mostly in records and photographs, in the memories of veterans who served aboard her, in the rusted sections of hull still visible at low tide off the Cornish coast. But her legacy persists in the Royal Navy's understanding of what ships and crews can accomplish when they refuse to accept defeat, when they fight, not because victory is certain, but because fighting is what they do, when they embody the quiet, stubborn, unshakable determination that characterized Britain in its hardest years. The Germans thought they'd sunk her. The sea tried to claim her. Her own navy finally had to cut her apart because she wouldn't go peacefully. HMS Warspite, from her launching in 1913 to her grounding in 1947, demonstrated what British steel and British sailors meant when pushed to the limit. They bent, they endured, they absorbed punishment that should have been fatal, and they somehow, stubbornly, impossibly kept going. That's not sentiment. That's not propaganda. That's just what happened, documented in action reports and damage assessments and German intelligence summaries that kept declaring the old battleship destroyed while she kept reappearing in new theaters with her guns still firing. The grand old lady of the fleet earned her nickname not through age but through sheer bloody-minded refusal to die, backed by crews who wouldn't let her go while she still had something left to give. And when the end finally came, when she'd given everything she had, and more besides, when they came to take her apart for scrap, she ran herself aground on Cornish rocks and made them work for it, even in death, defiant, even at the end, refusing to go quietly. That was Warspite, steel, smoke, and stubbornness, from first gun to last. A ship that embodied everything about British naval tradition that couldn't be taught or trained, but only demonstrated through 34 years of simply refusing to surrender while any fight remained.